Hey, welcome back. Quick favor before we start. Subscribe to this channel. I dig up real cases you won't hear anywhere else. Comment your city and your viewing time. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories like this one. All right, lights off, listen close. My daughter Haley had just turned 3 that September, and we were still adjusting to life in this old house outside Stillwater. At 24, raising her alone felt overwhelming most days, especially after her dad disappeared 6 months earlier without even a goodbye text. We'd found this place through a coworker at Dollar General, 2 bedrooms, peeling white paint, sitting at the end of a gravel road about 2 miles from anybody else. The isolation didn't bother me much since the rent was only $400 a month, and there was a decent backyard surrounded by tall prairie grass and scraggly oak trees that creaked against the roof on windy nights. Most evenings followed the same routine: pick up Haley from my mom's place after work, make something simple for dinner, fight through bath time while she splashed water all over the bathroom floor, then read her exactly 3 stories before she'd finally close her eyes around 8:30. That particular evening in early October started exactly like that: chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs, bubbles everywhere during her bath, and her favorite book about a rabbit who gets lost in the woods. After tucking Haley in with her stuffed elephant named Peanut, I collapsed onto our second-hand couch with some reheated coffee and my phone, grateful for a few minutes of quiet. The house had this way of settling at night, little pops and creaks that I'd gotten used to over the past 4 months of living there. But around 9:15, I heard something different coming from the kitchen. The back door handle was rattling, this metallic clicking sound that didn't match the usual house noises. That door was original to the house, probably from the 60s, solid wood on the bottom with 9 small glass panes on top, the kind with frosted privacy glass that only showed shapes and shadows. The deadbolt barely caught in the frame anymore, and I kept meaning to ask the landlord to fix it. For maybe 30 seconds, I sat there listening to that handle jiggle, telling myself it had to be the wind. Then everything went quiet for a moment, and that's when I heard them 3 heavy knocks, slow and deliberate, each one making the glass panes vibrate slightly. Through the doorway to the kitchen, I could see the edge of that door, and a dark shadow moved across those frosted panes, blocking out the dim porch light. The shadow wasn't moving like someone just passing by or a delivery person checking addresses. It lingered there, shifting slightly from side to side, like whoever it was kept leaning in to peer through different panes of glass. My first instinct was to call out and ask who was there, but something held me back. Maybe it was the deliberate way those knocks had sounded, or how late it was for anyone to be visiting. I slipped off the couch as quietly as I could, keeping my eyes on that doorway while I grabbed my phone from the coffee table. The kitchen light was off, which meant whoever was outside couldn't see in clearly, but it also meant I'd have to get closer to see anything more than that shadow. I crept toward the kitchen, staying close to the wall, my bare feet silent on the carpet and then the cold linoleum. When I reached the door frame, I pressed myself against it and slowly leaned around to get a better view. The shadow had moved to the far left pane now, and I could make out what looked like hands cupped around someone's face, trying to see inside. That's when the handle started turning, not rattling anymore, but actually turning slowly, testing whether the door was locked. The deadbolt held, but I could hear it straining against the frame, that old wood creaking under pressure. I pulled back from the doorway and held my breath, thumb hovering over my phone's emergency call button. The turning stopped, followed by silence that stretched for maybe 10 seconds. Then came a different sound, scratching like metal on wood, coming from lower on the door near the handle. Whoever was out there wasn't knocking anymore. They were working at something, and the systematic nature of those sounds made my chest tighten. I thought about Haley sleeping in her room, just down the hall, completely unaware, clutching Peanut with her mouth slightly open the way she always slept. The scratching continued for another minute before stopping abruptly, and the shadow disappeared, from the glass panes. But I didn't hear footsteps walking away on the wooden porch or crunching on the gravel path that led to our driveway. I stayed frozen against that wall for what must have been 5 minutes, just listening. The refrigerator hummed its usual tune. The oak tree outside scraped against the roof, but nothing from the back porch. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was someone drunk who got the wrong house, or teenagers playing a prank, though we lived too far out for random pranks. Then I remembered something that made my mouth go dry. The previous tenant, an older woman named Dolores, according to my landlord, had moved out suddenly after living here for years. He'd been vague about why, just said she needed to be closer to family. I'd found some of her mail still coming to the house, even some prescription bottles in the medicine cabinet that I'd thrown away. What if someone was looking for her, someone who didn't know she'd moved? Or worse, what if they did know and thought a young woman living alone would be an easier target? A soft thud from the side of the house snapped me back to the present. My bedroom window faced that direction, and it was cracked open about 2 inches to let in the cool night air. I backed away from the kitchen doorway and hurried down the hall, still trying to stay quiet, phone clutched in my hand with 911, already typed but not called. I reached my bedroom door and slowly pushed it open, peering into the darkness. The window screen was moving slightly, pushed inward, like something had pressed against it from outside. Through the gap under the raised window, I could hear breathing slow, controlled breaths that definitely weren't wind. Someone was standing right outside my bedroom window, probably on the old wooden crate I'd left there from when I'd been trying to fix the gutter. The breathing continued, steady and patient, and then I heard fingers running along the screen, testing its edges, looking for a way to pop it out of the frame. Every instinct screamed at me to grab Haley and run, but run where? My car keys were on the kitchen counter, right by that back door where this had all started. The front door was in the living room, but it led out to the same gravel driveway where this person could easily see us. I pressed call on my phone, turning the volume down as low as possible while the dispatcher answered. Whispering as quietly as I could, I gave our address, 4782 County Road 51, and explained someone was trying to break in. The dispatcher, a woman with a calm voice, told me deputies were on their way, but it would be at least 15 minutes given our location. 15 minutes. The fingers stopped moving along the screen, and I heard the wooden crate creak as weight shifted on it. Then came a sound that nearly made me scream, the window itself being pushed up, slow and careful. I'd forgotten to lock it after opening it earlier, and now it was sliding up inch by inch, the old wood frame groaning softly. I backed out of the bedroom and rushed to Haley's room, scooping her up as gently as I could while she stayed deep in sleep. She mumbled something about pancakes but didn't wake up, her small body warm and limp in my arms. Carrying her and Peanut, I went to the bathroom, the only room in the house with a lock on the door, even if it was just a flimsy push button one. I locked us in and sat on the closed toilet lid with Haley in my lap, rocking her slightly to keep her asleep while listening to every sound in the house. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking for updates in a hushed voice that I could barely hear. From the bathroom, I heard my bedroom window slide the rest of the way open, then nothing for about 30 seconds. After that came the unmistakable sound of feet hitting my bedroom floor, 2 soft thuds as someone climbed inside. The footsteps were careful but not silent, work boots maybe, moving across my bedroom toward the hallway. They paused at my doorway, and I held Haley tighter, praying she wouldn't wake up and make any noise. The footsteps moved down the hall toward the kitchen, and I heard drawers being opened, not ransacked but searched through methodically. The silverware drawer rattled, then the junk drawer where I kept batteries and random screws. Cabinet doors opened and closed with careful precision. This wasn't some desperate burglar grabbing valuables. This person was looking for something specific. The dispatcher whispered that deputies were 8 minutes out, and I whispered back what was happening. She told me to stay where I was, keep the door locked, don't engage. like I had any intention of confronting whoever this was while holding my 3-year-old. The searching sounds moved to the living room. I could hear the coffee table being moved, couch cushions being lifted. Then the footsteps came back down the hall, slower this time, and stopped right outside the bathroom door. The doorknob turned slightly, testing it, and found it locked. There was a long pause, maybe 20 seconds of absolute silence except for my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it through the door. Then came a voice, male, gravelly like someone who'd smoked for decades. "Dolores, I know you're in there. Just give me back what you took, and I'll leave. Nobody needs to get hurt. The wrong name, the wrong person, but the threat was clear enough." I stayed silent, holding Haley against my chest, her breath warm on my neck. The dispatcher was saying something, but I couldn't focus on her words. The man spoke again, louder. "Don't make this difficult. You've had 6 months to think about it. That money belongs to me, not you." He rattled the doorknob harder, and I heard him lean against the door, testing its strength. The bathroom door was hollow core, the kind you could probably punch through if you really wanted to. "I saw your car. I know you're home, and I know you've got someone in there with you. I heard you talking." My throat constricted as I realized he meant the dispatcher. He thought I was Dolores, hiding in here with someone else, and nothing I could say would probably convince him otherwise without revealing that a young mother and toddler were actually behind this flimsy door. The doorknob rattled violently now, and I heard him throw his shoulder against the door. The frame shook, and I saw the lock button wiggle. Haley stirred in my arms, making a small whimpering sound, and I quickly started humming softly in her ear, the same tune I used when she had nightmares. The man must have heard something because he stopped. "You got a kid in there, Dolores. That's low even for you." Using a kid as a shield. His voice had changed, uncertain now, maybe even confused. The dispatcher was saying the deputies were 3 minutes out, but 3 minutes felt like a lifetime. Outside the bathroom, I heard him pace a few steps, muttering something I couldn't make out. Then his footsteps moved quickly down the hall toward my bedroom. The window he'd come through. I heard him climbing back out, the wooden crate scraping against the house siding, and then feet hitting the ground outside. Still holding the phone, I whispered to the dispatcher that he was leaving through the bedroom window. She told me to stay put until deputies arrived. Don't leave the bathroom, no matter what. 2 minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance, growing louder as they turned onto our gravel road. The dispatcher confirmed they were pulling up to the house, and only then did I finally breathe properly. Haley woke up when the deputies knocked on the front door, confused and cranky, asking why we were in the bathroom. I carried her out, legs shaking so badly I could barely walk, and let the officers in. They searched the entire property with flashlights while one deputy, a young guy named Officer Brennan, took my statement. When they checked the back door, they found deep pry marks all around the deadbolt and frame. He'd been working at it with some kind of tool before moving to the window. On my bedroom floor, they found muddy boot prints and, strangest of all, an old photograph that must have fallen from his pocket. It showed Dolores, recognizable from the mail I'd seen, standing next to a man who looked like he could have been her son or nephew. Officer Brennan bagged it as evidence and said they'd try to track down Dolores to figure out what this was about. They stayed until dawn, and I spent the rest of that night packing our things. We moved in with my mom the next day, and I never went back, except to get the rest of our stuff with my brother and cousin present. The landlord said he understood and didn't charge me for breaking the lease. I found out later from Officer Brennan that they'd located Dolores in Arkansas. She'd apparently been taking care of her adult son with mental health issues, who'd been stealing from people to feed a gambling addiction. She'd taken his stash of stolen cash when she left, trying to return it to victims, but he'd tracked her down to the wrong place. They arrested him 2 weeks later at a motel near Tulsa. I still check every lock twice before bed, and Haley, now 5, doesn't understand why Mommy doesn't like it when people knock on doors after dark. The farmhouse sat 40 miles outside Billings, surrounded by wheat fields that rippled like water whenever the wind blew hard enough. My parents had moved to Phoenix for Dad's arthritis, but kept the property as a rental, and since it was between tenants that June, they offered it to me while I worked on my senior thesis. Montana State felt a million miles away out there, which was exactly what I needed after 3 years of dorm life and lecture halls. The isolation wrapped around me like a blanket those first few weeks. Just the creaking bones of that old house, the whisper of wheat stalks, and old Miss Garrison's pickup truck rattling past once a day on the gravel road. 12 acres of nothing but peace. My laptop and a stack of research books took over the kitchen table, and I fell into a routine that felt almost meditative. My old bedroom on the second floor faced the backyard, where this massive oak tree threw shadows across the walls at night, like long fingers reaching for something. The house had been built in the 50s, all hardwood floors that announced every step and windows that rattled in their frames when storms rolled through. For 2 weeks, the days blurred together beautifully, coffee from Mom's ancient percolator at 8, research and writing until my eyes burned, then frozen dinners while trying to stream something on internet that barely functioned. By 11 each night, I'd crawl into bed, feeling accomplished and exhausted in the best way. But around the 3rd week of June, sleep started breaking apart. I'd snap awake at 2, sometimes 3 in the morning, heart pounding like I'd been running, skin prickling with this electric feeling that made every shadow in the room seem important somehow. At first, I blamed the coffee, then the stress of my thesis deadline creeping closer. Maybe it was just the house settling in new ways, or coyotes passing through the property. Dad had mentioned they sometimes came close to the house, hunting for mice in the barn. But the feeling kept getting stronger, more specific. It wasn't just waking up anxious. It was waking up feeling observed, like when you sense someone reading over your shoulder at the library. The sensation always centered on my bedroom window, the one facing the backyard. During the day, that window was my favorite feature of the room, letting in morning light that made everything golden. But at night, with nothing but darkness pressing against the glass, it became something else entirely. I started leaving the curtains closed, telling myself it was to block the morning sun, not because of how exposed that rectangle of black glass made me feel. The 4th week brought a heat wave that turned the farmhouse into an oven. Even with every window open and 2-box fans running, the upstairs felt unbearable. On Wednesday night, I remember it was Wednesday, because I'd driven to town that afternoon for groceries. I gave up trying to sleep around 1:30. My sheets were soaked with sweat, and that familiar prickle of anxiety was already crawling up my spine. I sat up, debating whether to grab my pillow and try sleeping on the couch downstairs when I heard something that made me go completely still. Outside, maybe 20 feet from the house, came the distinct sound of a throat clearing, not a cough exactly, but that deliberate noise someone makes when they want you to know they're there. The sound was so casual, so human, that for a second I thought maybe Mr. Garrison had come by, though I couldn't imagine why he'd be in my backyard at this hour. I crept to the window, staying low, and peeked through the gap where the curtain didn't quite meet the wall. The moon was nearly full that night, casting everything in this silver, blue light that made the yard look like an old photograph. The oak tree's shadow stretched across the grass, and beyond that, the wheat field began, stalks barely moving in the still air. Nothing seemed wrong at first glance. Then I saw him. A man stood at the edge of the property line, where the mowed grass met the wheat. He was facing my window, completely motionless, arms hanging loose at his sides. Even from the 2nd floor, I could tell he was tall, maybe 6'3" or 6'4", wearing what looked like work clothes, jeans, and a light-colored shirt. His face was just a pale oval in the moonlight. But somehow I knew he was looking directly at me. Even though I was hidden behind the curtain, we stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, me crouched by the window, him standing in my yard like he'd grown roots. Then he took a step forward, just one step, slow and deliberate, like he was testing something. My whole body locked up, this primal fear flooding through me that made thinking impossible. He took another step, then another, moving toward the house with this strange, measured pace like someone walking through water. When he reached the oak tree, about 15 feet from the house, he stopped. His head tilted back slightly, and I realized he was looking up at my window more directly now. That's when I noticed the cigarette. The orange glow appeared suddenly as he took a drag, illuminating his face for just a second. I couldn't make out features clearly, but I saw enough hollow cheeks, deep-set eyes, and something wrong with his mouth, like he was smiling but only with one side of his face. He stood there smoking, never moving except to raise and lower the cigarette, keeping his eyes fixed on my window the entire time. My phone was on the nightstand just 5 feet away, but moving meant risking him seeing me. I tried to control my breathing, these shallow little gasps that made my chest ache, while my mind raced through options: call 9 or 11, run downstairs and lock myself in the bathroom, get to my car keys in the kitchen. Every plan seemed to end with me having to move, to reveal that I was awake and watching him. The cigarette glowed brighter as he took a long drag, and then he did something that made bile rise in my throat. He waved. Not a friendly wave, but this slow, deliberate movement of his hand back and forth, like he was cleaning a window. The gesture was so wrong, so out of place in the middle of the night, that I actually gasped out loud. His head snapped toward the sound immediately, that lopsided smile stretching wider. He knew exactly where I was. He'd known the whole time. The spell broke, and I rolled backward, grabbing my phone and punching in 911 with fingers that wouldn't work right. The dispatcher's voice sounded impossibly calm as I whispered that someone was in my yard, that I needed help now, please. He's just standing there,
watching me.
She kept asking questions. Was I safe? Was the house locked? Could I describe the person? While I crawled to the hallway, staying below the window line. Through the thin walls, I heard something that made my situation so much worse: footsteps on the wooden porch below, slow and heavy, testing each board like he was savoring the sound. The doorknob to the back door rattled once, twice, then stopped. I heard him walking around the house, pausing at each window, and I realized with sick certainty that I hadn't checked any of the locks before going to bed. The dispatcher was saying units were on their way, 15 minutes out, but 15 minutes felt like a lifetime when I could hear him trying the front door now, the knob turning easily in his hand. The door didn't open, though. By pure luck, I'd thrown the deadbolt after bringing in groceries that afternoon, something I rarely remembered to do. The doorknob stopped rattling, followed by silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then came a sound that turned my insides to water, the scrape of metal on metal. He was working on the lock, and from the purposeful rhythm of the sounds, he knew what he was doing. I pressed myself against the hallway wall, whispering to the dispatcher that he was trying to break in, that I needed to hide. She stayed on the line as I crept to my parents' bedroom, the only room with a lock on the door. My bare feet were silent on the old floorboards. I'd learned to navigate in darkness as a kid. Just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard the distinctive click of the deadbolt turning. The front door creaked open. Slowly, heavy footsteps entered my house. He wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. The footsteps moved through the living room with confidence, pausing occasionally like he was examining things. I heard drawers opening in the kitchen, the refrigerator door, then the squeak of the stairs as he began climbing to the second floor. Each step was deliberate, taking his time, and between the footfalls, I could hear him breathing, this raspy, excited sound like he'd been running. The dispatcher kept telling me to stay calm, to lock the door, that help was coming, but her voice felt distant and useless. The footsteps reached the landing and turned toward my bedroom first. Through the thin door, I heard him enter my room, the bed creaking as he sat down, then stood again. He was looking for me, checking the closet, even looking under the bed from the sounds of it. Then his footsteps moved back to the hallway, and I watched the strip of light under the door as his shadow passed by, heading to the bathroom, then the guest room, systematically checking each space. Finally, his shadow stopped directly in front of my parents' bedroom door. The doorknob turned slowly, meeting the resistance of the lock. Silence for a moment, then a soft laugh, not quite normal, more like air being forced through clenched teeth. He knocked 3 gentle taps like he was visiting a friend. "I saw you watching me," he said, and his voice was worse than I'd imagined, smooth and conversational with this underlying wheeze like damaged lungs. "That's rude, watching people." Another knock, harder this time. The dispatcher was practically shouting in my ear that units were 2 minutes out, but I couldn't respond, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare at that door handle as it jiggled violently. Then everything went quiet again. His shadow moved away from the door, and I heard him walk back toward the stairs. But he didn't go down. Instead, he sat on the top step. I knew that particular creak from years of sneaking in after curfew. He was waiting, and somehow that was worse than if he'd kept trying to get in. Sirens finally pierced the night, growing louder as they turned onto the gravel road. The man stood immediately, taking the stairs 3 at a time from the sound of it, his boots thundering through the house. The back door slammed so hard that something fell in the kitchen and shattered. Through the bedroom window, I saw him sprint across the yard, that tall figure moving with surprising speed toward the wheat field. He paused at the property line, turning back to look at the house one more time as red and blue lights flooded the driveway. Then he disappeared into the wheat, the stalks swallowing him like he'd never existed at all. The police found me 20 minutes later, still locked in that bedroom, still clutching the phone. They searched for hours with dogs and flashlights, but all they found were boot prints in the dirt and 5 cigarette butts arranged in a perfect line beneath my bedroom window, like he'd been there multiple nights, watching, waiting for the right moment. I left that same morning, threw everything in my car while the cops were still processing the scene. I stayed with a friend in Bozeman for the rest of the summer and never went back to that farmhouse alone. The police never caught him. They increased patrols in the area for a few weeks, told me he was probably some drifter who'd moved on, but I knew better. 2 months later, my parents sold the property to a developer who turned it into 3 suburban lots. The new houses have security systems, motion lights, cameras, all the things that might have helped me sleep that night. Sometimes I Google the address, looking at the street view of those modern homes where our farmhouse used to stand. The oak tree is gone too, cleared for a swimming pool, but I know if I drove out there at night, if I stood where my bedroom window used to be, I'd still feel him watching from somewhere in the darkness, patient as a spider, waiting for another window, another person to notice him standing in their yard. I just finished grading spelling tests that Thursday afternoon when I first heard the crying. Spring of 2018 in our little Texas town meant wildflowers everywhere and neighbors firing up their grills every weekend. I was living in my grandmother's old house on Willow Creek Drive, a street where mailboxes still had those little red flags and people actually used them. Teaching 4th grade kept me busy during the week, and at 32, I'd settled into a comfortable rhythm of lesson plans and weekend gardening. The house had been mine for 5 years by then, a 2-bedroom place with creaky floors and a kitchen window that looked directly into the backyard next door. My days followed a predictable pattern: school until 30:30, home to water the tomatoes, maybe a glass of wine on the porch, while watching the neighborhood kids race their bikes before dinner. That particular April had been unseasonably warm, the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer by noon. Everything about my life felt steady and safe, wrapped in the familiar sounds of lawnmowers and screen doors slamming. The Thompsons had lived next door for as long as anyone could remember, but after old Mr. Thompson passed away from a heart attack, his son Bradley moved in alone. Bradley was 40-something, worked at the hardware store downtown, and kept to himself mostly. He'd wave when he saw you, but never stopped to chat like his father used to. The man had this peculiar habit of wearing long-sleeved flannel shirts, even when the temperature hit 90 degrees, and his truck always had mud on it, despite the fact we hadn't had rain in weeks. He'd installed one of those tall privacy fences between our properties about 6 months after moving in, saying something about wanting to keep his German Shepherd from bothering anyone. Thing is, I never once saw or heard that dog. What really struck me as odd was how he'd completely renovated the old garden shed in his backyard. I could hear power tools running for weeks, sometimes until 2 in the morning. When I asked him about it once while getting my mail, he just said he was turning it into a workshop for woodworking projects, then quickly went inside his house before I could respond. It was a Thursday evening around 6:00 when I first heard something that made me stop washing dishes and listen. Through my kitchen window, I could see Bradley's shed, clearly painted dark green, with a small window covered by what looked like black plastic from the inside. The sound was faint, almost like a wounded animal, but there was something distinctly human about it. I turned off the faucet and stood there, soapy hands dripping, straining to hear better. The crying, because that's what it was, I realized, came in short bursts, muffled and desperate. My first thought was maybe Bradley had hurt himself working with his tools, but his truck wasn't even in the driveway. The sound stopped after a minute or so, and I convinced myself it must have been a cat. We had plenty of strays in the neighborhood, and they could make ungodly noises when they fought or got stuck somewhere. Still, something about the rhythm of those cries stuck with me. I dried my hands and went out to my backyard, pretending to check on my tomato plants, while really trying to get a better angle on that shed. The next few days, I found myself listening more carefully whenever I was home. Friday passed without incident, but on Saturday morning, while I was spreading mulch in my flower beds, I heard it again. This time it was louder, more distinct, definitely human, definitely distressed. The shed was maybe 30 feet from where I knelt in the dirt, and those sounds were coming from inside it. Bradley's truck was in the driveway this time, and I could see him through his kitchen window, calmly making breakfast like nothing was wrong. The crying turned into what sounded like someone trying to speak through a gag or covering words I couldn't make out but desperate in tone. My mouth went completely dry, and I realized I'd been holding my breath when Bradley suddenly looked up from his stove and stared straight at me through his window. I quickly looked away and focused on my gardening, but my mind was racing. Who keeps someone in a shed? The thought seemed insane, like something from a crime show, not something that happens in real life. Yet, those sounds, I spent the rest of the day trying to come up with logical explanations, while that sick feeling in my gut grew stronger. Sunday came with thunderstorms, the kind that knock out power and flood the streets within minutes. I figured the rain would mask any sounds from next door, but around midnight, a lightning flash lit up my bedroom, and I saw Bradley out there in the downpour, carrying something wrapped in a tarp toward his shed. He moved quickly despite the mud, and the way he kept checking around made my chest tighten with anxiety. I pressed myself against my bedroom wall, peering through the edge of my curtain as he unlocked what looked like 3 different padlocks on the shed door. The whole thing took maybe 2 minutes, but watching him struggle with whatever was in that tarp, something heavy by the way he had to readjust his grip twice, made me realize this wasn't normal workshop behavior. After he went back inside his house, I sat on my bed for hours, listening to the rain and trying to talk myself out of what I was thinking. But then, between thunder rolls, I heard it again, louder this time, more desperate. Someone was screaming behind that shed door, screaming words I could barely make out, please, and what sounded like home. My whole body turned cold, and I knew right then I wasn't imagining this. Monday morning, I called in sick to work, something I never did unless I was genuinely ill. But I couldn't leave, not when every instinct told me someone needed help next door. I positioned myself at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a clear view of Bradley's backyard, pretending to grade papers while really watching that shed. Around 10, After Bradley left for work, I did something that still makes me feel guilty and brave at the same time. I walked over to his fence and tried to peek through the gaps between the boards. The shed had no windows on the side facing my yard, just that one covered window facing Bradley's house. I could hear movement inside, shuffling sounds, and what might have been chains dragging across wood. Then, clear as day, I heard a young voice, couldn't tell if it was male or female, saying, as someone there, "Help me, please help me." My knees nearly buckled. This was real, this was happening, and someone was being held prisoner 15 feet from where I ate breakfast every morning. I backed away from the fence, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and ran inside to grab my phone. The 911 call was probably the most difficult phone conversation I've ever had. How do you explain that you think your neighbor is keeping someone locked in a shed without sounding like a paranoid lunatic? The dispatcher, a woman with a steady voice, kept asking me to slow down and repeat myself. I told her about the crying, the screaming, the voice begging for help just minutes ago. She asked if I could see anyone in immediate danger, and I had to admit I couldn't actually see inside the shed. There was a long pause before she said she'd send an officer to do a welfare check. 20 minutes later, a single patrol car pulled up. No sirens, no urgency, just Officer Garrett, a young cop who looked barely out of the academy. He listened to my story with a skeptical expression, took some notes, then walked over to Bradley's house and knocked. No answer, of course, since Bradley was at work. Garrett walked around the property from the sidewalk, shone his flashlight at the shed from a distance, then came back to tell me there was no probable cause to enter private property. He suggested I call back if I heard anything else concerning, and gave me his card. I watched him drive away, feeling completely helpless and frustrated. That afternoon, I did something I'm not proud of but felt was necessary. I called Bradley's work and pretended to be interested in buying lumber, asked specifically when Bradley would be available to help me. They said he was there until 5. That gave me about 3 hours. I grabbed the biggest hammer from my garage and walked straight to his backyard. To hell with trespassing laws when someone's life might be at stake. The shed door had 3 heavy, duty padlocks, just as I had seen, but the window on the side was my target. I smashed through the black plastic and glass with one swing, then used the hammer's claw to tear away the boards Bradley had nailed over it from the inside. The smell that hit me was awful human waste, sweat, and something rotten like old food. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness inside, I saw her, a girl, maybe 16 or 17, chained to a metal post Bradley had installed in the concrete floor. She was wearing a dirty tee, shirt, and shorts, her hair matted, her eyes wide with terror and hope. She tried to speak but only managed a hoarse whisper. "Water, please." I told her I was getting her out right now, then called 911 again, this time screaming at them to send everyone. "Send them now! There's a kidnapped girl in the shed at 427 Willow Creek Drive!" Everything happened fast after that. I stayed with the girl, talking to her through the window, while sirens grew louder in the distance. Her name was Ashley, and she'd run away from a foster home in Oklahoma 3 weeks ago. Bradley had offered her a ride at a truck stop, said he knew a place she could stay for a few nights, get a meal, and figure things out. She'd been in that shed for 18 days. 18 days of him bringing her water and gas station food twice a day, telling her that nobody was looking for her, that foster kids disappeared all the time and no one cared. She showed me the bucket in the corner, the thin mattress on the floor, the notebook where she'd been scratching marks to count the days. When the police arrived, 3 cars, then 5, then the whole street was flashing red and blue. They had to use bolt cutters on the chains. The EMTs wrapped Ashley in one of those silver emergency blankets, and she grabbed my hand before they put her in the ambulance, squeezing it so tight I could feel every bone. "You saved my life," she whispered, and I just nodded because I couldn't speak through the tears. The image of her being wheeled away on that stretcher, finally safe, is something I'll never forget. Bradley arrived home from work right as they were putting up crime scene tape around his property. I'll never forget the look on his face when he saw the police cars, the ambulance, the shed door hanging open with investigators taking photographs inside. He didn't run or fight. He just stood there by his truck, shoulders sagging like he knew it was over. They arrested him right there on his driveway, while half the neighborhood watched from their yards. As they put him in the patrol car, he looked straight at me, and his expression wasn't angry or threatening. It was almost relieved, like he was tired of carrying the weight of what he'd done. The detective told me later that Bradley confessed to everything during questioning. He'd been planning it for months, specifically targeting runaways because he thought no one would miss them. The soundproofing he'd installed wasn't perfect, but it would have been good enough if I hadn't been paying attention. They found receipts for the materials, internet searches about missing teenagers, even a journal where he'd written about his plans. The shed had been designed as a prison from the start, the concrete floor, poured specially to hold that metal post, ventilation holes drilled to keep someone alive, but not comfortable, the door reinforced from the inside. The investigation revealed that Ashley wasn't supposed to be his first victim. Police found evidence that Bradley had been watching and documenting patterns of other runaways at various truck stops across Texas for over a year. He had photographs, license plates of people who gave them rides, notes about which days had the most vulnerable kids passing through. Ashley just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time when Bradley felt ready to execute his plan. What haunts me most is that he told investigators he chose our neighborhood specifically because it was quiet, full of people who minded their own business, and his father's reputation would protect him from suspicion. He was right about almost everything, except he didn't count on me being a teacher, trained to notice when something's wrong with a young person, even when I couldn't see them. The prosecutor said my 911 calls, especially the second one, saved Ashley's life. Bradley had been growing frustrated with her resistance, and his journal entries from those final days suggested he was considering ending the situation soon. Those were his actual words, like she was a problem to solve instead of a human being. Ashley recovered physically within a few months, though I know the emotional scars will last much longer. She sent me a letter 6 months later from her new placement, a group home in Colorado that specializes in helping trafficked and abused teens. She said she was learning to trust again, taking online classes to catch up on school, and had adopted a rescue cat named Warrior. We still exchange Christmas cards, and last year, she sent me a photo from her high school graduation. Bradley got 40 years in federal prison for kidnapping and false imprisonment, though he'll be eligible for parole in 25. I moved out of that house 2 months after it happened, not because I was scared, but because I couldn't stop staring at that empty shed, couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if I'd called the police after the very first time I heard crying. The new owners tore it down immediately, planted a garden where it used to stand. Sometimes I drive by the old neighborhood, and it looks exactly the same as before, peaceful and quiet. But I know better now. I pay attention to things others might dismiss, trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right, and I'll never again assume that terrible things can't happen just because the street looks safe and the neighbors wave hello. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over small Nebraska neighborhoods at night, the kind where you can hear a dog barking 3 blocks away or a garage door opening down the street. I'd been living in this house about 20 minutes outside Lincoln for 8 months, working from home as a freelance graphic designer, spending my days in the front office, watching the predictable rhythm of suburban life through my window, the mailman at noon, kids getting off the school bus at 3:30, sprinklers turning on at dusk. Everything had its schedule, its pattern, its comfortable predictability. The house next door belonged to Walter Hutchinson, a man probably in his late 60s who existed more as a ghost than an actual neighbor. During my entire time living there, I'd spotted him maybe 3 times total, Always at dawn, when he'd shuffle out to check his mail, wearing this faded blue windbreaker with reflective strips that caught the street light just before sunrise. He moved like someone who didn't want to be noticed, quick and purposeful, never making eye contact or acknowledging anyone's existence. It was February when I first noticed Walter's basement light clicking on in the middle of the night. My bedroom window faced his house, and around 2 or 300 a.m., this harsh fluorescent glow would suddenly flood through my blinds, bright enough to wake me from a deep sleep. Initially, I didn't think much of it. Insomnia hits everyone differently, and maybe the old guy liked to tinker with projects when he couldn't sleep. But after a couple of weeks, something started bothering me about the whole situation. Walter's beat up Ford truck hadn't moved from his driveway in what seemed like forever. Dead leaves had accumulated in thick drifts around the tires, and the windshield was covered in that yellowish, green pollen that comes with early spring. His lawn had transformed into a jungle, the grass reaching almost knee-height, full of dandelions and wild growth that would have driven any self-respecting homeowner crazy. The mailbox was stuffed to capacity with catalogs and envelopes scattered on the ground beneath it, like nobody had touched them in weeks. What really got under my skin was the randomness of it all. Some nights, the light would stay on for 4, maybe 5 hours straight, and I'd drift in and out of sleep with that glow bleeding through my window. Other nights, it would flicker on for just 10 or 15 minutes before plunging back into darkness. I started keeping a notebook by my bed, jotting down the times just to see if there was any logic to it. 200 a.m. on Monday, 300 a.m. on Tuesday, nothing Wednesday, then 100 a.m. on Friday. No pattern whatsoever. The strangest part was that I never saw any other lights in the house. Not the kitchen, not the living room, not even the porch light, when he'd supposedly be going down to the basement. Just that single rectangular window, glowing like some kind of beacon in the night, casting long shadows across his overgrown yard. By the 3rd week of this, I couldn't ignore how wrong everything felt. Walter's house looked abandoned in every way except for that basement light. Spider webs had formed across his front door, thick and undisturbed. A package from Amazon had been sitting on his porch for at least 10 days. The cardboard warped from rain and sun. Even his garbage bins hadn't been moved to the curb in over a month. I knew because I'd been paying attention, watching from my office window during the day, trying to catch any sign of life. The neighbors on the other side, the Johnsons, mentioned they hadn't seen Walter either when I casually brought it up while getting my mail, but nobody seemed particularly concerned. "He's always been odd," Mrs. Johnson said, shrugging like this was just Walter being Walter. "Keeps to himself, you know how some people are." That Friday night, I decided I'd had enough of the mystery. The light had been on since midnight, and by 200 a.m., I was wide awake, staring at that glowing window from my bedroom. I threw on a hoodie and my old sneakers, the ones that didn't squeak, and stepped out into the cold February air. The neighborhood was dead quiet except for the distant hum of the interstate a few miles away. Walter's yard felt like stepping into a different world. The grass was so tall it soaked my jeans up to the knees with dew, and I had to push through it like I was wading through water. The closer I got to his house, the louder my heartbeat seemed, thundering in my ears. I wasn't planning anything illegal, I told myself, just wanted to peek through the basement window, maybe see what was causing that light. The window sat at ground level, one of those narrow, rectangular ones that most basements have, and it was cracked open about an inch, letting out a thin line of bright white light and the faint sound of something I couldn't quite identify. Maybe a fan or some kind of machinery. I crouched down next to the window, my knees sinking into the wet earth, and tried to angle myself to see inside without being too obvious. The glass was dirty, covered in spots of mud and dust, but through the grime, I could make out part of the basement. What I saw made my whole body go rigid. The walls were covered, absolutely covered, in photographs. Not family photos or artistic shots, but what looked like surveillance photos, people walking, sitting in cars, entering buildings. all taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. They were pinned up with red thumbtacks in neat rows, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Some had writing underneath in black marker that I couldn't read from my angle, but what made my throat close up was recognizing some of the faces. There was Janet from the coffee shop downtown, the one who always remembered my order. There was Mr. Castellano, who taught at the local high school. There was even a photo of the teenage kid who delivered newspapers on Sunday mornings. My legs were trembling as I shifted position to get a better view, and that's when I saw the far wall, the one with the larger prints. These weren't just random surveillance shots. These were photos of people who'd been in the news recently, their faces familiar from missing person posters I'd seen around town and on social media. Amanda Reeves, the college student who'd vanished from the university campus 3 months ago. Douglas Harper, the accountant whose car was found abandoned by the river in January. Sophia Mendez, the nurse who never showed up for her shift at the medical center and hadn't been seen since. Their photos were arranged in a timeline with dates written underneath, some dating back years. Below each missing person's photo was a series of other shots of them at grocery stores, walking their dogs, sitting in their cars at red lights. The level of documentation was insane, like Walter had been tracking these people for weeks or months before they disappeared. In the corner of the basement, I could see what looked like file boxes, dozens of them, labeled with years going back to at least 2010. The sound of a door creaking from inside the house sent a jolt of pure panic through me. I dropped flat against the wet ground, my cheek pressed into the mud, not daring to breathe. Through the thin crack of the window, I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the basement floor. Then a voice, Walter's voice, but different from the few times I'd heard him speak before. He was talking to someone, his tone conversational, almost cheerful. "You're being so quiet tonight," he said, and there was something deeply wrong about the way he said it, like he was talking to a child or a pet. "That's okay. We have plenty of time. No one even knows you're here." The footsteps moved closer to the window, and I could see a shadow pass by. I pressed myself flatter against the ground, praying the tall grass would hide me. My phone was in my pocket, and I slowly reached for it, trying not to make any movement that might catch his attention through that cracked window. Just as my fingers wrapped around my phone, Walter's footsteps stopped directly above me on the other side of the window. I could hear his breathing, raspy and uneven, like he'd been smoking for decades. "Did you hear that?" he said to whoever was in there with him. "Sounds like we might have a visitor." My entire body locked up, muscles so tense they hurt. Through the tiny gap, I could see his feet in worn brown slippers, standing maybe 2 feet from the window. He stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, then walked away, his voice getting fainter. No, probably just a raccoon. They've been getting into everything since nobody's been cutting this grass. I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore, then slowly, painfully slowly, started crawling backward through the grass. Every movement felt like it took forever, every rustle of the grass sounding like an explosion in the quiet night. I made it back to the property line, then to my yard, my clothes soaked and covered in mud. Once inside my house, I locked every door, checked every window, and called 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher sounded skeptical at first. A concerned neighbor reporting suspicious activity isn't exactly high priority. But when I mentioned the missing person's photos, Amanda Reeves specifically, her tone changed completely. "Officers are on their way. Stay in your home and keep your doors locked." Within 15 minutes, the street was flooded with police cars, no sirens but lights flashing, reflecting off every house on the block. I watched from my window as they surrounded Walter's house, and then heard them through a megaphone asking him to come out. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then they broke down the door. The shouting that followed was intense but brief, and I saw them bring Walter out in handcuffs, his blue windbreaker still on, his face completely calm like he'd been expecting this. He looked directly at my window, as they put him in the patrol car, and the expression on his face wasn't anger. It was disappointment, like I'd ruined something he'd been working on for a very long time. The next few hours were a blur of police interviews and evidence collection. They found Amanda Reeves in a soundproof room Walter had built in a corner of the basement behind a false wall. She was alive, dehydrated and traumatized, but alive, and had been there for 6 days. The other missing people weren't as fortunate. The police found remains buried in various locations throughout the county based on detailed maps Walter had kept in those file boxes. Turned out he'd been doing this for 13 years, selecting people who fit specific criteria he'd written out in notebooks they recovered. He worked as a night security guard at a warehouse for decades before retiring, a job that taught him about surveillance, about watching, about patience. The photos on his wall represented years of stalking, and the police counted at least 47 victims, though they suspected there were more. Walter had been using his basement as what investigators called a collection point, keeping victims there before moving them to secondary locations. They never let me see the full extent of what they found in that house, but the detective who interviewed me said I'd saved Amanda's life and potentially prevented more disappearances. Walter Hutchinson pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and got multiple life sentences without parole. The house next door was eventually demolished after sitting empty for a year, and now there's just an empty lot there that nobody wants to build on. Sometimes at night, I still wake up around 2 or 300 a.m., and I find myself looking out the window at where that basement window used to be. The neighborhood returned to its quiet routine. Mailmen at noon, kids off the bus at 3:30, sprinklers at dusk. But I can't forget Walter's voice that night, talking to Amanda in the basement, or the way he looked at me as they drove him away. I've thought about moving, but somehow staying feels like bearing witness to what happened here, making sure people remember. Because the scariest part wasn't discovering what Walter was doing, it was realizing he'd been doing it for over a decade, while we all lived our normal lives right next door, never suspecting that our boring, quiet neighborhood was hiding something so evil. The Ford Ranger's engine knocked, like it always did when I pushed past 50, reminding me why Frank kept nagging me to let him rebuild it at the shop. Route 19 stretched ahead through Millbrook's outskirts, nothing but darkness and the occasional reflective post marking where the asphalt met the drainage ditch. I just finished wrestling with Mrs. Crawford's big transmission for the past 6 hours, grease still caked under my fingernails despite scrubbing them raw with that orange pumice soap. The radio crackled with static between stations. You could never get decent reception once you passed the Dawson farm. November nights in West Virginia had a particular weight to them, cold seeping through the truck's worn weather stripping, making me crank the heater that only worked on the highest setting. My phone showed 11:07 p.m. on the cracked screen, and I was already planning which leftover to heat up first. When the lights hit my mirrors, red and blue alternating in that pattern that makes your chest tighten even when you know you've done nothing wrong, the cruiser appeared out of nowhere. I hadn't seen headlights behind me for the last 10 miles. I eased off the gas and pulled onto the narrow shoulder where the field met the road, dry corn stubble on one side and thick woods on the other. Through the side mirror, I watched the Crown Victoria settle in behind me, its engine idling rough, probably one of those old Interceptors the county bought at auction and never properly maintained. The spotlight snapped on, flooding everything in surgical white brightness that turned my cab into a fishbowl. I killed the engine and rolled down my window, cold air rushing in along with the sound of boots on gravel approaching from behind. The deputy who appeared at my window wasn't anyone I recognized, which was strange in a place where you knew every cop by their coffee order. He had one of those faces that seemed assembled from mismatched parts, nose too sharp, jaw too wide, eyes set deep enough that the spotlight's glare couldn't reach them. His uniform looked regulation, except for how it hung on him like it belonged to someone else, someone bigger. The nameplate read, Deputy Carlisle, but the letters seemed worn, hard to make out. He leaned down, bringing with him the smell of cigarettes and something else, something chemical like antifreeze or formaldehyde. His flashlight beam hit my face, then swept through the cab's interior, lingering on my toolbox in the passenger footwell. The work and voices scattered on the dash, finally settling on my hands gripping the steering wheel. License and registration, he said, but his voice had this quality to it, like he was reading lines he'd memorized but didn't quite understand. I reached for my wallet, moving slow and deliberate the way my dad taught me, announcing each movement. The deputy watched my hands with an intensity that made the hair on my neck prickle. When I handed over my documents, his fingers were ice, cold despite the thick gloves he wore, and he held my license up to his flashlight for what felt like a full minute, studying it like he was memorizing every detail. Your tail lights out, he finally said, still staring at my ID. Going to need you to step out of the vehicle so we can take a look at it together. The way he said, together, made my mouth go dry. I knew for a fact both tail lights were working. I'd checked them myself that morning when I'd done the routine maintenance on the truck. Frank was particular about his employees maintaining their vehicles, said it was bad advertising for a mechanic to drive around with broken lights or squealing brakes. Deputy, I'm sure they're both working fine, I said, keeping my voice level despite the crawling sensation working its way up my spine. I can show you from here if you'd like. He tapped my license against the window frame, a rhythmic sound that seemed too loud in the quiet night. Each tap left a small mark on the glass, and I noticed his wedding ring was on the wrong hand, worn on his right ring finger instead of the left. Need you to step out, he repeated, and this time his free hand moved to rest on his service weapon, not threatening exactly, but deliberate enough to make the message clear. The woods beside us were silent. No insects, no wind through the trees, like everything was holding its breath. I unbuckled my seatbelt slowly, and that's when I saw it in the side mirror. There was someone else in the cruiser's passenger seat, just a shadow really, but definitely there, not moving, just watching. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out, and immediately, Deputy Carlisle positioned himself between me and my truck door, close enough that I could see the stubble on his neck was growing in strange patches, like a bad skin graft. Walk to the back, he instructed, gesturing with his flashlight toward my truck bed. As we moved, I noticed the cruiser's license plate was covered in mud, deliberately it seemed, and the unit number on the side was partially scraped off. We stopped at the tailgate, and I could clearly see both lights glowing red in the reflection off the cruiser's hood. See, Deputy, they're both working. He stood there for a moment, flashlight beam dancing between the perfectly functional tail lights, then turned to me with this expression that wasn't quite a smile. No, that one's definitely out, he said, pointing to the left light that was clearly illuminated. You need to come sit in my vehicle while I write this up. Department policy for safety violations. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but where would I go? Miles of empty road in either direction, thick woods on both sides, and this deputy with his hand still casual on his weapon. I'd rather wait by my truck if that's all right, I said, pulling out my phone. Let me just call my roommate to let him know I'll be late. The screen wouldn't turn on, completely dead, even though it had been at 40% when I left the shop. Carlisle noticed and made this sound in his throat, not quite a laugh. No need for calls. This will just take a minute. He stepped closer, and I could smell that chemical odor again stronger now, making my eyes water. Protocol says you need to sit in the cruiser. Don't make this difficult. Behind him, that shadow in his passenger seat shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of what looked like hair, long and tangled, pressed against the window. I know my rights, I said, taking a step backward toward my truck. I don't have to sit in your vehicle for a traffic citation. Something changed in his posture then, a stillness that reminded me of a snake before it strikes. He pulled his radio from his belt, but when he pressed the button, No static came through. No dispatcher response. The thing wasn't even turned on. Unit 12 requesting backup at mile marker 37. He said into the dead radio, his eyes never leaving mine. Driver being non-compliant. He clipped it back to his belt like he'd actually spoken to someone, then said in this flat, emotionless voice, "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time. Get in the cruiser." The spotlight from his car suddenly went out, plunging us into darkness except for his flashlight beam. And in that moment of adjustment, I heard car doors opening, not just his, but multiple doors, like there were more vehicles I couldn't see. I didn't wait to find out who or what was coming out of those cars. I bolted toward my truck, yanking the door handle, just as Carlisle's hand grabbed my shoulder. His grip was impossibly strong, fingers digging in through my jacket, but I twisted hard and felt the fabric tear as I pulled free. I threw myself into the cab, slamming the locks just as his flashlight smashed against the window, leaving a spiderweb crack. The engine turned over on the third try, while fists pounded on the glass, and not just Carlisle's. I could see other shapes in my peripheral vision surrounding the truck, one face pressed against the passenger window, mouth moving like it was trying to speak. But the features were all wrong, skin too loose like a mask that didn't fit right. I threw it in drive and floored it, gravel spraying as the truck lurched forward. And in the rear view, I saw at least 3 figures standing in the road, all wearing what looked like sheriff's department uniforms, all watching me drive away without pursuing. I didn't slow down until I hit the Millbrook city limits, pulling into the 24-hour gas station with my whole body trembling, adrenaline making everything too bright and sharp. The attendant, a kid named Jerome who I had gone to high school with, took one look at me and asked if I needed him to call someone. I almost said yes, call the police. But then stopped. What would I say? A deputy tried to get me in his car. I asked Jerome if he knew a Deputy Carlisle, and he gave me this confused look. There's only 4 deputies in the whole county, man. Robinson, Vance, Harold, and that new lady, Simmons. No Carlisle. My torn jacket and the cracked window were the only proof I had that anything had happened. Jerome let me use the station phone to call Frank, told him I'd had car trouble and wouldn't make it in tomorrow. Then, I sat in that fluorescent, lit gas station until dawn, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt water, watching every car that passed. The next few days, I kept my mouth shut, went to work, stayed in town after dark. But I started asking careful questions, casual, like while changing oil or rotating tires. That's when the stories started surfacing. Old Mrs. Henley mentioned her nephew from 2 towns over who'd gone missing on Route 19 6 months back. Car found abandoned with the driver door open. Jerome's cousin had a friend who swore he'd been pulled over by a deputy that didn't exist, barely got away when 2 other cruisers appeared out of nowhere. The more I dug, the more I found always Route 19, always between 11 p.m. and 3:00 a.m., always someone traveling alone. The real sheriff's department, when I finally worked up the nerve to check, had no record of any traffic stops at mile marker 37 that night. They suggested I might have encountered someone impersonating an officer, took a report, said they'd investigate. But I could tell from their faces they'd heard this before, and nothing ever came of it. I left Millbrook 2 weeks later, packed everything I could fit in that Ford Ranger with its cracked window, and drove straight through to Ohio without stopping. Found another mechanic job, another small town, but one with more people and better cell service. Frank understood, didn't even make me work out my notice before I left. Jerome pulled me aside at the gas station and handed me a folder. Inside were newspaper clippings he'd been collecting, going back 3 years, missing persons reports, abandoned vehicles, all connected to that stretch of Route 19. The last clipping was from just 2 days after my encounter, a traveling salesman from Maryland, last seen heading through Millbrook around midnight. His car was found the next morning at mile marker 37, driver door open, both taillights working perfectly. They never found him, just like the others. I still check the West Virginia news sometimes, looking for updates, but deep down, I know the truth. Whatever's happening on Route 19, it's still happening, And the real horror is that someone, somewhere, knows exactly what it is. Six months working as head librarian at the public library in Rosewood, Georgia, had taught me the rhythm of small town life. Everybody knows everybody here, the kind of place where the biggest scandal is usually who forgot to return their library books on time. The library itself is this beautiful, old brick building from the 1920s with tall windows that let in streams of dusty light and wooden floors that creak with every step. Most days, I'd spend my time helping high school kids with research papers or chatting with the elderly readers who came in for the air conditioning and romance novels. Mrs. Eloys would bring me tomatoes from her garden, and old Mr. Hutchins would fall asleep in the biography section every Friday afternoon like clockwork. It was peaceful, predictable, exactly what I needed after the chaos of Atlanta. The town had maybe 3,000 people, 2 traffic lights, and one main street where everyone did their shopping. The city council had finally approved renovations for the library's basement after years of water damage complaints. We needed to clear out decades of accumulated junk before the contractors could start work the following Monday. I volunteered to handle it myself because I wanted to catalog everything properly. There could be town history down there worth preserving. The basement was this maze of metal shelving units packed with donation boxes nobody had touched since the 80s. Old equipment covered in dust sheets, and stacks of yellowing newspapers tied with twine. The air was thick with that musty smell of old paper and mildew, behind a wall of moldy encyclopedias that practically disintegrated when I moved them. I found 3 cardboard boxes sealed with heavy, duty packing tape that had turned yellow and brittle with age. Someone had written, "Piropadwy of Rasimod PD Dio not destroy," across the top in faded black marker. My curiosity got the better of me. The tape practically crumbled when I cut through it with my box cutter. Inside the first box were manila folders, dozens of them, each one containing what looked like missing person reports. The paper was that old government issue beige color, typewritten with actual typewriter keys, that left indentations you could feel with your fingers' names, dates, photographs, paper, clipped to the corners. People who had vanished from Rosewood going back to the 1960s. What caught my attention wasn't just the number of files, but how each one was stamped CLOCD in red ink with no resolution notes, no follow-up reports, nothing to indicate what happened to these people. Just name after name: Luis Carpenter, age 23, disappeared May 1967. Robert Engine, age 45, disappeared October 1973. Teenage kids, middle-aged parents, elderly folks, no pattern to the ages or backgrounds. The second and third boxes contained more of the same. By my count, there were 78 missing person cases, all from Rosewood and the surrounding county, all marked closed without any explanation. The most recent file was from 2008, a woman named Maria Vasquez, who worked at the local grocery store. I actually remembered when she supposedly moved away suddenly to care for a sick relative in California. That's what everyone said, anyway. But here was her files reported missing by her landlord when she didn't pay rent, her car found abandoned on Route 42. The responding officer's notes mentioned blood on the driver's seat, but the case was closed 2 days later with no further investigation documented. I spent the next 3 hours photographing every single page with my phone. The battery died twice, and I had to run upstairs to charge it at my desk, terrified someone would come down and find me with these files. My mind kept racing. How could a town this small have so many missing people without anyone talking about it? We had a weekly newspaper, town meetings, gossipy neighbors who knew when you changed your curtains. But 78 people gone, and nobody ever mentioned it. The dates were spread out enough, maybe 3 or 4 per year, that perhaps people just forgot, moved on, accepted whatever story they were told. But seeing them all together like this, documented in black and white, made my chest tight with anxiety. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about those files. I made the mistake of going to see Chief Coleman at the police station. He'd always been friendly when I'd seen him around town, mid-50s, coached, little league. the type who'd help you change a flat tire. The station was just a small building next to the post office. Only 4 officers total for the whole town. When I told him about the boxes, showed him a few photos on my phone, his whole demeanor changed. His jaw clenched, and he leaned back in his chair, studying me with this calculating look I'd never seen before. "Those records are sealed for a reason," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "Some things are better left buried. Delete those photos, return the boxes to where you found them, and forget you ever saw them. For your own good." The way he said it wasn't threatening exactly, but it made every hair on my arms stand up. I didn't delete the photos. Instead, I went home to my little rental house on Sycamore Lane and uploaded everything to 3 different cloud services. Then I started researching the names from the files. Most led to dead ends, no social media, no obituaries, no mentions in other towns. But a few had family members still looking for them. I found a Facebook group called Missing Voices of North Georgia, where a woman named Beverly was still posting about her sister, Louise Carpenter, every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. The same Louise from the 1967 file. Beverly lived just 2 hours away in Marietta. I sent her a private message, attached the photos of her sister's file, and asked if she wanted to meet. She responded within minutes. "How did you get this? I've been trying to get information from Rosewood PD for 40 years. That's when the black SUV appeared. The first night, Wednesday, I noticed it parked across from my house around 10 p.m. when I was closing the living room curtains. Government plates, tinted windows so dark you couldn't see inside. It was still there when I checked at midnight, at 3:00 a.m. when I got up for water, and gone by sunrise. Thursday night, same thing, except this time it was parked 1 house down. By Friday, it was right in front of my mailbox. I tried taking a photo of the license plate, but they'd covered it with mud deliberately, just enough to obscure the numbers, but not enough to look suspicious to anyone passing by. I knew they wanted me to see them, to know I was being watched. The message was clear without anyone saying a word. Saturday morning, I met Beverly at a diner in Dahlonega, halfway between Rosewood and Marietta. She was in her 70s, thin and sharp-eyed, carrying a worn folder full of her own research about Louise. Her hands trembled when she saw the police file photos on my phone. They told us she ran off with some boy. She whispered, voice cracking, said she'd been seeing someone secretly. My parents believed them, but I knew Louise. She was planning to start nursing school that fall, had already bought her textbooks. Beverly showed me letters she'd written to the FBI, the state police, even the governor's office over the years. Every single one had been redirected back to Rosewood PD, who always gave the same response: case closed, no evidence of foul play. She told me about other families she'd connected with over the years, all with missing relatives from the Rosewood area, all given similar excuses. What Beverly said next made my mouth go dry. Her nephew was a state trooper, and he'd done some unofficial digging for her about 5 years earlier. He'd found property records showing that the Rosewood Police Department owned 16 acres of undeveloped land about 8 miles outside town, purchased in 1962. The land had no buildings, no stated purpose, just thick woods and a single dirt access road. But satellite images from Google Earth showed regular tire tracks leading in and out, and what looked like disturbed earth in several areas, patches where the vegetation grew differently. When he tried to access the property to investigate further, he was pulled over by Chief Coleman himself and told his career would be over if he ever came back to Rosewood. He'd transferred to a different county the next week and refused to talk about it anymore, even to Beverly. I gave Beverly copies of all the files I'd photographed. We agreed she'd share them with the other families while I tried to find a journalist who might investigate. But when I got home that afternoon, my front door was standing wide open. Nothing was stolen, nothing destroyed, but everything had been touched. Every book on my shelves was pulled out exactly 1 inch. Every picture frame was turned to face the wall. My kitchen drawers were all open precisely halfway. Even my bed sheets were folded down in a perfect triangle, like in a hotel. The precision of it was worse than if they'd ransacked the place. They wanted me to know they'd been through everything, that they could enter whenever they wanted. I found my laptop in the refrigerator still running, with a sticky note on the screen that just said, Steop. My phone, which I'd left charging in the bedroom, was now in the bathroom sink, displaying a photo I hadn't taken, a picture of me at the diner with Beverly, shot from a distance through the window. That night, I packed everything important and drove to my cousin's house in Tennessee. I didn't tell anyone in Rosewood I was leaving, just never showed up to work Monday morning. I later heard they said I had a family emergency, then that I'd had a nervous breakdown, and eventually that I'd taken a job elsewhere. The same kind of stories they'd probably told about those 78 missing people. I sent all the files to 3 different news outlets and the FBI field office in Atlanta, but nothing ever came of it. Beverly called me once to say 2 other families had received visits from Rosewood police, warning them about spreading false information. She was scared but determined to keep fighting. I still check the news for Rosewood sometimes, waiting for the story to break, for someone to investigate that 16 acres of woods. But small towns keep their secrets, and sometimes the people sworn to protect and serve are the ones making sure those secrets stay buried. My name is Aaron, and a few years ago, I worked the overnight shift at the only 24-hour gas station in our town in Kentucky. The pay wasn't great, but it gave me enough to cover rent on my little duplex and keep food in the fridge. Nights there had their own rhythm truckers topping off their rigs, regulars grabbing cigarettes, and the occasional drifter passing through. I got used to the hum of the soda machine, the buzzing neon sign that never stayed fully lit, and the kind of silence that settled between customers when the hours stretched too long. One night started out the same as any other. I stocked the cooler, swept the floors, and leaned against the counter, scrolling on my phone whenever things slowed down. Around midnight, I noticed an older sedan pulling into the lot. The headlights washed over the windows before it circled once and rolled back onto the road. At first, I didn't think much of it. People miss the entrance all the time, or they realize they're low on cash and drive off. But then, maybe 20 minutes later, the same car came through again, looping around slow enough that I could make out its dented bumper and one dim headlight. By the 3rd time that car came back, creeping around the pumps without stopping, I felt a knot forming in my chest. No one got out, no one rolled a window down, just that same slow lap, tires crunching over gravel before disappearing again into the night. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was someone lost, or maybe waiting for someone else. But the longer the hours dragged on, the harder it was to ignore the way my stomach tightened every time I thought I saw headlights in the distance. Around 4 in the morning, my shift was ending, and I went about locking up. That's when I spotted it. Down the street, past the edge of the lot, the same sedan sat parked on the shoulder. Its headlights were off, but I could still recognize the shape, the dent in the hood, the dull shine of its paint under the street lamp. I stood with the keys in my hand, pretending to fumble with the lock longer than I needed to, just to keep from turning my back completely. It didn't move. No door opened. It just sat there like it was waiting for me to leave first. I finally made it to my car, trying not to glance too obviously in the direction of the sedan. The air felt heavy, the kind of quiet that made every sound sharper, my keys jingling, the slam of my door, the click of my seatbelt. When I pulled onto the road, I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror for the first couple of blocks. Nothing happened. Then, just as I started to think I'd imagined the whole thing, headlights flickered on behind me. The same car, same dented bumper. It eased onto the road, trailing me at a steady distance. My heart pounded so loud it almost drowned out the hum of my engine. I didn't want to drive straight home, so I made a few random turns through the quiet streets, circling blocks I didn't normally take. The car followed each one, never speeding up, never backing off. It was like they knew I was testing them and were content to let me know they weren't going anywhere. After 10 minutes of this, I pulled into a brightly lit parking lot near an all-night diner and just sat there, pretending to dig through my bag. The sedan slowed as it passed but didn't turn in. It kept going, disappearing down the next street. When I finally got home, it was already past 5. I barely slept, every little sound outside pulling me back awake. The next morning, I thought maybe I'd worked myself up over nothing, that whoever it was had just been messing around or drunk. But when I showed up for my next shift, one of the officers from the local police department came into the store. He leaned on the counter, asked if I'd seen a certain car the night before, and described it down to the dent in the hood. My throat went dry. I told him everything, how it circled 3 times, then sat parked down the street. The officer nodded like he wasn't surprised. He said they'd found the car abandoned near the edge of town, doors unlocked. Inside, there were rolls of duct tape, a pack of zip ties, and a pair of gloves shoved into the glove box. He didn't say much else, just told me to be careful walking to my car, and to call if I noticed anything strange again. I stood behind that counter long after he left, staring at the pumps in the empty lot beyond, trying to wrap my head around how close I might have come to being someone's target that night. The rest of that week felt unreal. Every time headlights appeared in the distance, I caught myself holding my breath. Customers came and went like always, but I couldn't shake the image of that car sitting in the dark, waiting. Even walking through the aisles of the gas station gave me a strange awareness of how isolated the place really was after midnight, how long it would take anyone to notice if something happened to me. I stopped wearing headphones, stopped stepping outside to smoke on breaks. I kept every door locked and the phone close at hand. A couple of nights later, another officer came by and asked if anyone had approached me in the parking lot. I said no, and he explained that the vehicle had been reported stolen. They never found the person who had been driving it. That detail rattled me worse than anything else. The thought that someone out there, someone who had circled me over and over, was still walking around free made it hard to concentrate on even the simplest tasks. Every face that came into the store became a question mark I couldn't answer. After that, I changed routines. I started parking my car right under the brightest light in the lot and asked a coworker to stay on the phone with me until I was safely inside. For weeks, I couldn't stop running through possibilities in my head. Was it a robbery that never happened? Something worse? Did they just get spooked when they realized the police were nearby? None of it added up, and not knowing became its own kind of weight I carried into every shift. People in town whispered about it for a while, but eventually, like most things, the talk faded. I never saw that sedan again, but I also never worked another overnight alone. To this day, when someone asks why I quit the gas station, I don't say much. I just tell them the truth in the simplest way. Once you've had someone circle you like prey, and then find out what they had waiting in the car, you stop pretending those long, quiet nights are harmless. You start seeing the dark for what it really is, a cover for people you'd rather never meet.